Our next group of protists we're going to be discussing are the plant-like protists. So again, we are breaking down all of our odds and end category into three categories. Our first was protozoan, which was animal-like. Now we're talking about plant-like protists. Like animal-like protists, plant-like protists go by a different name as well. It is probably something you've commonly heard, which is algae. I'm sure this isn't the first time you're hearing that word. Like plants, algae are going to be autotrophic, so we don't really need or necessarily have a concern for movement for a lot of these. That's not saying they don't move. It's just not our number one concern. So therefore, we're not going to really break it down based off of how they move. Just a fun fact for you. Most of the oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere is actually from algae. It does not come from plants. So whenever you're like, oh, when we get rid of all the trees, we won't have any oxygen. Well, that's not really true because most of that oxygen isn't coming from trees. It's coming from algae, um, which again are plant-like protists. Um, Algae come in different sizes. Some of them will be unicellular. Some of them will be multicellular. Some can live in colonies that make it look like they are multicellular, but they're actually unicellular. They're all kind of working together for a common goal, even to the point where some will specialize in a certain area, and that's really the only thing they do. So, for example, some might specialize in reproduction, and other algae in the colony won't reproduce, but these certain ones will, and therefore the other ones can focus on other tasks at hand that will benefit the whole community or the whole colony. Our first type that we're going to talk about are diatoms. We mentioned them at the very beginning when you saw this picture. They do have cell walls, which give them this rigid shape, so keep that in mind. A lot of them use little slime to move around. So these are examples of algae that can move. They produce a little slime and they kind of float down on it. When they die, these cell walls stay intact and don't really biodegrade too well, and they kind of float to the bottom, and we get what's called diatomaceous earth. You might have heard of if you polish things, because it is a polishing agent. But diatoms are pretty cool looking, I think. Next, we saw a video at the beginning of the chapter about dinoflagellates. These are unicellular algae, and they do have a bioluminescence to them. So when you do end up smacking them, they let out a burst of bioluminescent glow, and that gives it that kind of bluish tint glow that they have. So anytime the wave crashes, that smacks them, and they let out that bioluminescence. Keep in mind, dinoflagellates will have two flagella. I mean, they are flagellates. But those are pretty cool. Next are the euglenoids. These ones are nifty because they are both heterotrophic and autotrophic, and as you can see from our picture here, they do have a flagella coming out of it. They are unicellular, and a lot of times we refer to these as green algae as well. So a lot of times you see these guys when in your fish tank and on tops of ponds and stuff like that. Red algae is another type. We see a lot of red algae in the oceans, but they can be multicellular. These are going to be your seaweeds at times, and they do have kind of red pigments that absorb the small amounts of sunlight that are able to break down to the deeper sections of the ocean. Keep in mind it still goes through photosynthesis. It's just adapted to use a wider span of sunlight that reaches it. Next, we're looking at green algae. Again, your euglenoids can be in this category. They can be multicellular, they can be unicellular, and they can form colonies. Scientists can argue that some of these will be plants, so keep that in mind if you're doing any research on things. For our purposes, green algae is going to be a protist, though. Your brown algae, you're probably familiar with kelp. Kelp is a brown algae. Kelp forests can grow pretty large. You can get this picture over here for reference. Here's your normal sized human, and this will be one thing of kelp. going all the way up. They are pretty large, and they do house a lot of other organisms because they provide protection in the oceans. But again, it is a type of seaweed. It is not a plant. Keep that in mind. Over here, we do have the breakdown of what kelp actually is. You'll note that it does have a holdfast. These are not roots like plants would have. These do not take in nutrients from the soil. It does not take in water from wherever it's planted, because these things are in moist environments to begin with. So we don't really need a root system. This is a holdfast. It just keeps it in place. You will also note that kelp has gas bladders, which will help it float, and it'll help it keep its upright shape and therefore expose its fronds, which are these little structures coming off these fronds that will help it collect sunlight to produce food.